There are names in France that were never supposed to belong to ordinary people. De Montfort, de Rohan, Fitzgerald lines that crossed the channel and came back changed. Names that carried, for centuries, an unspoken promise that somewhere behind the everyday farmer, the shopkeeper, the schoolteacher, stood a knight, a lord, a bloodline written into the old registers of the aristocracy. For generations, the story was simple. A surname was a seal. If your family carried a noble name, you carried noble blood. The name proved the lineage, and the lineage proved the name. Then genetics looked closer, and the seal did not hold the way anyone expected. This is the story of what happens when the oldest form of European identity, the inherited surname, is placed next to the newest form of evidence humanity has ever had access to, the genome itself. It is a story about 14 surnames, about the myth of unbroken noble blood, and about a truth that turned out to be both more complicated and, in its own way, more remarkable than the legend. For most of French history, surnames were treated as fixed inheritance, especially among families claiming noble descent. The system seemed airtight on paper. Patronymic names, passed from father to son alongside land, title, and coat of arms, were legally and socially enforced for centuries. Genealogists built entire archives around this assumption, tracing a name backward through parish records, feudal rolls, and heraldic registries, confident that a shared surname meant a shared paternal line stretching back to a single medieval founder. It made sense. Aristocratic families guarded their names fiercely, precisely because a name carried land rights, tax exemptions, and social standing. Why would anyone risk diluting a bloodline that came with legal privilege attached to it? The assumption of purity was not naive. It was, for a long time, socially and legally reinforced from every direction. But researchers studying the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, began finding something the old registries could not explain. Men sharing the same rare noble surname, some from families who had documented their lineage back to the same medieval founder for 6 or 7 centuries, were carrying different, unrelated paternal signatures. Not distant cousins with slightly diverged genetics. Men whose Y chromosomes pointed to entirely separate ancestral lines, incompatible with a single shared father centuries ago. Something in the chain had broken. Somewhere, at some point in 700 years of history, the name had continued forward while the biology had not. This is where the science stopped being a footnote and became the center of the investigation. Y chromosome analysis is uniquely suited to this kind of question, because unlike most of our DNA, it does not blend each generation. It passes largely intact from father to son, meaning that men who truly share a paternal ancestor within the last several centuries should carry closely related Y chromosome signatures. Mitochondrial DNA does the same for the maternal line. And autosomal DNA, the broader mix inherited from both parents, gives researchers a wider picture of how a family's total ancestry has shifted and blended over time. Together, these tools do something parish records never could. They read biology directly, independent of what any document claims. When French genealogical researchers began applying this to noble surnames, the results did not simply confirm the old family trees. In many cases, they split them apart. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. In family after family, researchers found what geneticists call non-paternity events scattered through the historical record, not necessarily scandal, not necessarily deception, but simply the ordinary, quiet reality of human lineage. Adoption into a name, a title passed through a daughter and her husband who took her family's name to preserve the inheritance, guardianship arrangements formalized as sonship, or, in some cases, an undocumented father whose biological line simply was not the one. Written into the official record. The story did not collapse. It widened. If you find this kind of unraveling compelling, the idea that a name we treat as fixed and sacred might be carrying a completely different biological story underneath it, this is worth staying with, because the deeper researchers dug into individual family lines, the more the pattern repeated across regions that had nothing else in common. Faced with this pattern, researchers laid out several explanations, and importantly, no single one accounts for every case. Each noble surname seems to carry its own version of the story. The first explanation is the most mundane and, statistically, probably the most common: ordinary non-paternity events accumulating quietly over centuries. A wife's child by another man, absorbed without comment into the family line, common in every population studied this way, nobility included. The second is legal and cultural rather than biological: name transmission through female heirs. In cases where a noble line produced no surviving son, it was not unusual for a daughter's husband to adopt her family name and coat of arms to preserve the title, deliberately continuing the name while breaking the paternal biological line on purpose, with the full knowledge and consent of everyone involved. The third is subtler, and in some ways more interesting than either: the deliberate absorption of unrelated families into a noble name through fosterage, patronage, or feudal service, where loyal retainers or illegitimate but acknowledged sons were formally granted use of a family's name and arms as a reward, blending unrelated paternal lines into what looked, on paper, like a single unbroken house. None of these explanations require deception on a grand scale. They require only what every human population has always contained: complexity, quiet exception, and the space between what a record says and what biology preserved. The turning point in this investigation came from a broader shift in method. Earlier surname studies in France worked with small sample sizes, often just a handful of men per name, gathered informally and compared without a wider reference population. That made it easy to dismiss a single mismatch as an error, a lab mistake, an outlier. More recent research changed that by comparing much larger panels of Y chromosome data across France, cross-referenced against broader European ancestry databases and, in some cases, against ancient DNA recovered from medieval burial sites. This allowed researchers to distinguish between a genuine documentation break within the last few centuries and something else entirely: deeper ancestral signals reaching back before the surname itself existed, before the feudal system that produced it, sometimes before France was recognizably France at all. And this is where the investigation produced its most surprising result. It was not simply that some noble surnames carried broken paternal lines. That researchers expected. The surprise was what a subset of those broken lines actually contained. In several documented cases, the Y chromosome signal carried by a family claiming purely Frankish or Norman noble descent turned out to align more closely with paternal lineages common in populations far to the south, or in some cases, with signatures more associated with Iberian or even North African contact during the medieval period, echoes of a much larger, messier web of movement, conquest, marriage, and migration than any single noble genealogy ever recorded. Not the family history anyone expected. Not even the region anyone expected. The genome was not simply erasing the old family story. It was revealing an older, wider one sitting underneath it, one that had nothing to do with any single castle or any single coat of arms, and everything to do with how thoroughly medieval Europe's populations had already been mixing long before anyone started writing surnames down at all. This matters beyond genealogy, beyond aristocracy, beyond any specific list of 14 old names. It matters because it exposes something almost every culture has quietly believed at some point: that identity travels cleanly down a single line, unbroken from one origin point to the present. Genetics keeps showing the opposite. Populations are not pure threads. They are woven things, strands crossing, breaking, rejoining, absorbed and released across centuries, shaped as much by law, marriage, and social convenience as by biology itself. A surname, it turns out, was never really a record of blood. It was a record of belonging, legal, social, sometimes deeply loving, sometimes purely strategic, and belonging has never required a perfectly unbroken paternal line to mean something real. Picture, for a moment, the landscape where these names were first written down. The rolling chalk hills of Normandy, where fortified manor houses once controlled entire valleys of farmland. The river towns of the Loire, where noble houses built their power on control of trade moving toward the coast. The stone villages of the Auvergne, isolated by volcanic highlands, where families intermarried across generations simply because there was no one else nearby to marry. In every one of these places, a name was assigned to a family standing in a specific hall, on a specific piece of land, at a specific moment, and then it simply continued, carried forward by whoever stood in that hall next, whether or not the blood beneath the name stayed exactly the same. If stories like this interest you, the quiet gap between what a family believes about itself and what the genome actually preserved, it is worth staying close to this kind of research, because nearly every old family name in Europe is holding some version of this. Same hidden complexity, waiting for the right comparison to bring it into view. So what does it mean, now, to carry one of these 14 surnames, believing it marks a line of medieval nobility reaching back 7 centuries? It does not mean the name is false. It means the name was always doing something more complicated than marking pure descent. It was marking a house, a claim, a continuity of position and privilege that outlasted, in many documented cases, the biological line that first established it. The nobility was real. The land was real. The history attached to the name is, in most cases, genuinely old. What the DNA complicates is only the assumption that blood and name moved together, unbroken, every single generation, for 700 years. The old story was not a lie. It was simply too small, too clean, built for a world that wanted lineage to be a straight line rather than the tangled, human thing it actually was. The map is still incomplete. More noble surname lines are still being tested. More medieval remains are still being recovered and compared. Each new case adds another thread to a picture of medieval Europe that looks less like a set of separate, sealed bloodlines and more like a single, constantly shifting population, wearing different names in different halls, carrying the same underlying story of movement, contact, and quiet reinvention that shaped nearly everyone on the continent. What began as a question about 14 old names became something larger, a reminder that a name is not a wall sealing a family off from the rest of humanity. It is a doorway, thin and old, and behind it runs a longer, wider river of ancestry than any single crest or title was ever built to contain.